Hi, and welcome to this special presentation from Cooperative Business New Zealand. Obviously, we're disappointed that we weren't able to host the Business Leaders Forum today, and we hope that this goes some short way to making up for the fact that we weren't able to go ahead. And we'd really like to say thank you to Rabobank for supporting us on this journey in the true spirit of cooperation. So we recognise that there's challenging times for our members, and this panel discussion is part of trying to support you to address those issues that you're facing right now. I'd just like to hand over to Rawdon, who is kindly facilitating the session with us today.
Hello and welcome to this special presentation from Cooperative Business New Zealand, kindly brought to you with the support of Rabobank New Zealand, growing a better New Zealand together. Now we're here to discuss cooperative enterprise in the time of COVID-19. What are the impacts and the opportunities for our member-owned business sector here in New Zealand? I think we've all been watching current global events with a degree of dismay. We're struggling to get to grips with the speed and the enormity of these changes. So with me today, I have four experts who are well placed to share their insights on where we're at and the future impacts of COVID-19 on our co-op sector. We've got Greg Smith, Head of Research at investment research and funds management house Fat Profits. Also here is Tim Hunt, Head of RaboResearch, Food and Agribusiness Australia and New Zealand. Priti Ambani is joining us, Head of Innovation at Tech Futures Lab. And representing the New Zealand Government is Labour MP and Chief Government Whip, Michael Wood. Thanks particularly to you, Michael, for giving us some time. I imagine a very busy time for government, but we'll get to there very shortly. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us. So what we're going to do to kick off is hear from each of you about your general views of what we're dealing with here. So for 2 or 3 minutes, if each of you in turn can give us a little bit of an idea of your impression on what's happening here and how we see this playing out for the New Zealand cooperatives and members-owned sector. Greg, I'll start with you. What are we looking at?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Rawdon, and hi, everyone. Yeah, I mean, looking at it from, I suppose, a markets perspective and an economic perspective, both macro and micro, obviously, these are very trying times. And obviously, the headlines are coming out every day. Businesses are having to be agile, having to react. And there's obviously a lot of uncertainty about where COVID-19 is going to go in terms of the infection rate and in terms of the economic impact. Look, most certainly from an economic point of view, this quarter is going to be tough. The next quarter is probably going to be tough. But what's the outlook beyond that? And I think obviously no one really knows that. Whether we're going to get a U-shaped, long drawn-out recovery, are we going to see a deep recession, or are we going to see a V-shaped recovery? Look, I think from our perspective, and if you look at the financial markets as well, obviously they're pricing in a lot, and COVID-19 certainly has a lot to live up to in terms of its impact. The New Zealand stock market is down over 20% since its February peak. But you look at the actions that are being taken, obviously globally, and also here we've had a little bit of a window, I suppose, being an island, to sort of make some response. And they have been significant. You look at the containment measures with respect to inbound traffic, obviously effectively. Planes are no longer flying internationally effectively. And obviously there's certainly going to be an impact there. Obviously the numbers are being reported each day in terms of infections, in terms of deaths, which is obviously getting into the psyche of consumers and businesses. And we don't know whether we're going to be going down the path of total lockdowns in terms of what Italy have faced, in terms of what Trump is being talked about. So there's all that uncertainty. But on the other side, and from a financial perspective, I guess, you could say that authorities and governments know the drill. We've seen $2.5 trillion in stimulus planned. We've seen obviously the RBNZ make a big move on rates. We're hearing today that the RBA across the Tasman are lining up quantitative easing. And of course, the central banks are trying to ensure that businesses continue to function as best they can, keeping the wheels of credit going with respect to the banks. And just on that point, obviously a lot of comparisons are being made with the GFC. I think there are some differences. And particularly being in our industry, going back to the GFC, no one really knew whether the financial system was going to be around next week. You think of all those banking fails. I feel this is a bit different in terms of a black swan event, if you want to call it that. I think there is another side to it. I think we can also take some heart from the experience in China. They had this virus obviously the start of it a couple of months ago, and you look at their economy, their factories are going back to work. They're pretty much successful through some extreme measures at stopping COVID-19 in its tracks. And obviously there's going to be some fallout for the New Zealand economy, severe fallout, the consumer and so on. China's one of our biggest customers, if not the biggest. So I think we can take some heart from that.
Yeah, Greg, it's, I mean, we've talked quite a lot in recent weeks about, we're looking back to what we could have learned from previous events. However, literally in the last few days, we've recognized this now to potentially be completely unprecedented in any way. And so you mentioned the GFC. The SARS, as far as a comparative event goes, the SARS virus, I mean, how does this compare with that? Can we compare with that? Have we learned anything from that which we can apply?
Yeah, well, it's a natural comparison there. And I think, look, the Asian region had actually, sort of talk about knowing the drill. They know the drill, and they obviously have been through this before effectively with that. Obviously, 2003, China was a much smaller portion of the of the global economy. I think for New Zealand, it was around about 4% of goods, and now we're more like 25%. So certainly we can learn from that. Back then, I think I'm right in saying the economic impact to New Zealand GDP was about 0.08%. So it's going to be more this time around. And I think that's why it's probably more serious. Also, the infection rate has spiked a lot quicker, and it's spread to a lot more countries quicker than it did back in 2003, and that has people concerned. And as I said, like the fact that we're even more online these days, we're getting these statistics thrust into our computers every day. But maybe some perspective is also needed. I'm not sort of understanding the gravity of it, but if you could consider if we had a real-time update in every newspaper and every online forum of the number of influenza cases each day and the deaths from that, that would be staggering, right? But obviously we don't get that. And obviously, look, COVID-19 is different. We don't have a vaccine as yet. I think there's a bit of a race going on there, and that's probably another story. So look, I think there is another side to this, but obviously there will be natural comparisons with SARS. Another point I'd make it as well, when we're talking about pandemics, you look at swine flu, and that really didn't have, and looking, I suppose, at a silver lining. I was speaking to a medical professional yesterday, and the death rate on that was around about 10 or 11%. And I think as we get more clarity with testing on cases with respect to COVID-19, it looks like, I think the latest estimates are it's around about 0.7 or less than 1%.
Okay, thanks for that, Greg. We'll speak to you again very shortly. I now want to move to Tim Hunt from Rabobank. Tim, I mean, Greg's tried to paint a relatively positive picture moving forward. Is that how you're thinking things as well?
I think that there are reasons to think this might not be as bad as the global financial crisis, but it's still going to be a major demand event for agriculture. We have two problems at the moment in terms of exporting food and beverages to the world. One is logistical disruption, lack of workers driving trucks in China, lack of staff in warehouses has fed through to build up of containers at the ports. And while that is starting to improve somewhat, those problems are likely to occur to some extent elsewhere in the world now. So there are logistical disruptions that make it difficult or more difficult to get product to market. And the second issue we have is demand impacts of this. The first channel we're seeing this through is a slump in food service demand, either because governments are mandating that restaurants close or people are simply choosing to stay away from restaurants where they come into close proximity with others who might be sick. We're seeing a catastrophic situation in food service markets offshore with sales of companies like Yum China that owns KFC and Pizza Hut in that country reporting sales down around 60% at the height of this crisis. That is heavily impacting consumption of products that New Zealand sends there, such as seafood and beef and sheep meat that are heavily oriented to food service. And the longer this goes, we then start to run into income effects. We'll see rising unemployment in many countries, if not all countries. As a result of this, there'll be less hours available to work for part-time workers. And as incomes fall, we will see some impacts on consumption of food. That becomes because typically in agriculture, supply doesn't adjust that quickly. So the first half of 2020 is going to be characterised by weakening demand, and then we're going to have to reduce prices to try and clear the supply that will inevitably come online. And we're starting to see this in the data. In February, the shipments of animal protein from New Zealand to China fell almost 60% year on year in volume terms. Prices in offshore markets in US dollar terms for things like lean beef are down around 10% so far. Whole milk powder in US dollar terms off up to 20%. Happily for New Zealand, that the currency is somewhat an automatic stabilizer there. The worse things get in the global economy, the more the New Zealand currency will fall. It's already down around 13% since mid-January. So that's offsetting at least half of the damage we're seeing to pricing around the world. And finally, this is an adverse demand shock, but it's not the only shock in town. We have to remember that we're still working our way through the multi-year impacts of swine fever in China that has left that country chronically short of animal protein. And even if their demand weakens this year at consumer level for animal protein, they'll still need to import more than they did before to supplement what is still falling local production. So perhaps not as bad as the GFC, but we're still going to see material demand impacts out of this that will result in supply falls because we can't turn off supply quickly, will result in price falls, I should say. Happily for New Zealand, some offset from a fall in currency and ongoing benefits from swine fever in China.
Tim, you just mentioned that you just said this compares slightly favourably to the GFC. You've talked about dairy pricing. I mean, when it comes to dairy pricing, it's so important for the New Zealand economy and so many members, so many cooperatives. So it's good that you say it's not as bad as it was, but there's still so much uncertainty.
There is uncertainty, but I think it's important to distinguish between uncertainty as to how bad this gets in this 6-month period versus certainty around the period for recovery. I agree that it's very hard to predict how bad the economic fallout and the impact on demand and pricing for dairy will be in the next 6 months or so. At the same time, you'd find very few medical professionals who think this will be a 2021 health issue. We will see a huge spread of this virus, but we will then develop herd immunity to that, and the rates will slow down and dissipate probably this year. So we do have some benefit that there's a fairly high degree of certainty that this is not a 2021 event as well. There's a finite time frame around this, and that's a luxury we didn't have with the global financial crisis. And I think that's likely to see this a more navigable period than the financial crisis, even if it is difficult.
And dairy is going to play a much greater role compared to the GFC. So, of course, that was our biggest export sector industry then. Now it's tourism. Tourism right now is, as we all know, struggling beyond comparison to anything before. So dairy really is going to play a key role this time round.
Yes, and while we talk about adverse demand and price impacts on dairy and agricultural products generally, it's still a pretty good place to be through these types of crises. We're still likely to see production hold up reasonably well. It'll be off a bit this year, maybe 1%, due to dry conditions in particular, the tail end of the season. But 1% isn't a bad result in terms of when we compare it to tourism and so forth, even if the fall in revenues will be somewhat more so due to price impact. So agriculture is typically a fairly good industry to have a big footprint in at times like these.
Thanks, Tim. We'll come back to you as well very shortly. I want to now go to Priti Ambani because I mean, here we were meant to be at a conference together today, at a forum, and we're all sitting here on Zoom. So how is COVID-19 right now driving the change in the way our businesses are organized and the ways we're working?
Unprecedented in one word. I think in the last week, I think from a New Zealand point of view, we've been slightly fortunate because we've seen sort of the events unfold across the world. And we've had, I think, a little bit of time to prepare from a business contingency standpoint. But what I see happening in the last few days here is businesses having to rethink everything they do, right from the way they work, what is their business model, how are they responding to the next few months. We're looking at most businesses looking at the next 12 weeks to create significant impact for their bottom line, for their employees, the way they work, and everything in between. What I just heard on this call is COVID-19 has presented this really unforeseen event in terms of impacts to the supply chain, the demand side, and underpinning all of that is health implications to employees, staff, stakeholders, and the community, and which is really testing times for businesses. What we are seeing is now, businesses are in crisis mode. There's a lot of crisis management happening in terms of succession contingencies. How are we conducting businesses virtually? Looking at what are the critical operations that business needs to do. Who are the critical people? Because a lot of the folks, business teams did not even have visibility on who are the essential staff. So there's a lot of thought now being, time and effort being devoted to some of these, critical operations and critical staff who need to be there for business continuity. Looking at also, business critical functions, understanding what are the impacts of, key business personnel and them not being there due to illness of a loved one or themselves, travel requirements, travel being completely put on hold. And, there are lots of positive spins around this, which I'm hoping to highlight in these times of grim and, just real all-round negative news. Is I think this is an opportunity for businesses to have a rethink about how they do this. What are their key offerings? What are the ways they can become more resilient? I see this COVID-19, as possibly, one of many challenges we have as a business and a business community, from others being impacts from climate change, for instance. So how do we create business resilience, I think is a key issue. In terms of how businesses are responding, we're seeing increased remote working. There have been instances of businesses in New Zealand looking at a remote working drill to see what happens. We obviously have teams working remotely or individuals on teams, but the entire business going remote. And we've seen some teams creatively create a drill, remote working drill. One day we're all working offline last week, and what are the kinks in the system? Where are the issues around the equipment you need, or the communications protocol, or the way we work, how we communicate with our customers and clients. Just essentially everything taking, a new look at all of that. And what I see as opportunity now for businesses to tighten up, actually understand what are the ways they can create long-term improvements, productivity gains, and skills upgrade. This is a real good time to look at how well prepared are we? What are the contemporary skills we need? What are the digital skills we need? And rethink skills, competencies for this increasingly digital world. So really, I think this is a time of great opportunity. While I'm definitely not mincing my words with respect to the impacts that businesses are facing. I think this is also a time of opportunity for businesses across New Zealand to understand how they can create, moving forward, a resilient business from all aspects, whether that's people well-being, how do they manage sort of this time of stress for their employees as well, and create robust, resourced businesses that are ready for these kinds of impacts in the long run. I think lastly, what I'd like to say, sort of also highlight is this has highlighted our reliance on increasingly capitalistic models. And I think this is a time to rethink our models, and cooperative businesses in that sense are well placed to think about how we leverage our supply chains, leverage local economies, hyper-local economies to create business resilience, almost create this and plan. We do this is great, this is our current core model, but how do we develop this and model here on the side, which is a resilient, which will help us diversify and think and test new ways of continuing to create business value. So I'm really optimistic from that sense, and I'm looking to see some really bold business decisions being taken in the coming days.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it, Priti? Because what you're saying is, of course, we're adapting right now to a situation which we have to adapt to, but actually what we're also doing is finding out the way that we have to go, or potentially could go, as far as the long-term future goes forever. I mean, particularly when you're saying, and the difference between your large organizations, corporations, and your small businesses, identifying for large corporations, they are going to be seeing who they actually need and who they potentially don't need anymore going into the future. This
That's
key
right.
personnel thing.
Absolutely. And that is a big wake-up call for employees and workforce across the board, right? If you are someone that the business can do without, what does that mean for you? What does that mean for your skills? What does that mean for being ready for these kinds of situations that, again, I'd repeat, this is not the last time we're going to see something of this impact. So I think it's a big wake-up call for workforce, innovation teams, business strategy, all of the above. Business as usual is dead, as far as I can see, and it's going to take a lot of innovative, bold thinking to be ready and thrive in these situations. So I'm looking forward to those kinds of decisions, really.
Great, thanks, Priti. Right, I want to move to government now. MP Michael Wood, you'll have been listening to this very clear. I mean, there's a lot of positivity here, which I guess people just don't really have a choice about if you want to continue to go. Meanwhile, you guys, and you've added to this, have announced this massive stimulus package. So I guess just tell us a little bit about the New Zealand economy and the key points from the stimulus package as far as cooperatives are concerned.
Well, look, when Grant Robertson announced the package in the House the other day, he was very clear that we can't sugarcoat the situation. This is an enormous hit on the global and domestic economy, potentially the biggest impact on our economy and society since the Second World War. So we're taking it incredibly seriously. And one of the things that you see coming through is the degree of interconnectedness that we have, both internationally and domestically. There are going to be very few sectors who aren't hit by what is unfolding as a result of COVID-19. The approach that we've taken is that we have to be all in this together, and I think there's some alignment with co-op values there. We need to have leadership at all levels, from government, from business, from civil society on this, and we're going to need quite an active government in order to help coordinate things, to work with social partners and to get us through. We've also been really clear that while this package is extremely large, at 4% of GDP, pretty much the largest intervention that any state has made in the world in response to this crisis, while it will have an impact, Treasury's estimated it might reduce the economic contraction from 3% down to about 1%. We're not going to be able to save all businesses, and we're not going to be able to save all jobs, but we can certainly take the edges off and help to provide confidence and cash flow to businesses. So I think most people will be familiar with the key elements of the package. There's the support around wage subsidy, which is going to be hugely significant. The point that I would make around this one is that that's a $5.1 billion package out of the 12.1 in total. That pretty much all flows out through the economy over the next 12 weeks. So that is about getting serious cash flow into the hands of workers and businesses to keep things moving along. Because what we've heard from businesses, that's a critical problem at this stage. If that cash flow seizes up, we have serious systemic risks of people folding all over the place. We're also trying to provide flexibility to businesses within that. So for eligible businesses, the amount which goes up to $150,000 and is kept there, gets received as a lump sum. So it won't sort of be dribbled out week in, week out. It'll be a lump sum to enable businesses to work through in the way that is best for them over that period to preserve jobs and to keep things moving along. Also quite significant changes, obviously the support around leave as well for people who are having to self-isolate. There's additional support coming in there. One of the things that hasn't been talked about quite as much are the changes in the tax area, and these are significant as well. Again, they're focused on ensuring that people have got cash flow and are able to keep things going and keep investing as well. So one of the bigger ones there is shifting back to depreciation on commercial and industrial buildings. This was removed under the previous government. It's worth about an extra $2.1 billion for eligible businesses. It's a permanent measure. It's not just for the course of this crisis. And doesn't have to be triggered for a business by an impact. It's a change to the tax system, which is open to everyone. And then also a number of other changes around writing off of small assets up to $5,000 as well instantly. These are things that people have asked for a while, and I think they'll help a great deal in this particular situation. So we've tried to be pretty decisive with this package. We've called it phase one. We know that this is going to be a long haul challenge for the New Zealand economy and the international economy. So we're not ruling out further measures. And we'll also have the budget, of course, coming up in a couple of months, which also enables us to look at where we're at and look at how we move into a recovery mode potentially, which is where we're hoping we might be. But as I say, we're in this for the long haul, and our focus is on keeping confidence and keeping up cash flow. One thing I want to say, just riffing a bit off Priti's comments, it sounds a bit odd to be talking about opportunity in the midst of what is a serious crisis for economies and societies all over the world. But it is often actually in times of crisis that you get a significant level of hard thinking and innovation coming through. That's always been the case. And I think we do have to look at it in this way. Businesses, public services, governments are going to have to look at doing things differently. We're going to have to look at the ways in which people work. We're going to have to look at doing things in a more nimble way. We're going to look at things that I think will potentially actually achieve some good outcomes, like reducing our carbon footprint. How can we be smart around those things? And are there opportunities to actually make some of those positive changes enduring rather than things that just get us through?
Interesting, Michael. You're giving us very much the impression that the conversation within government's potentially shifting from this is happening, here's the reality, we've got to throw some safety nets out there right now economically to business and workers. And now you're beginning to think more longer term. I mean, has the thinking officially become more longer term? I mean, do you guys, how far ahead are you looking?
Yeah, look, we have to prepare for this as a long-term impact on our economy and our society. That's supported by the scientific advice and the public health advice. We cannot say exactly for how long that will be. There are all sorts of sages and galaxy brains on the internet at the moment who think that they know and talk with total certainty on questions like this. No one can do that. What we have to do is to be prepared, to be willing and able to see things through in the long term, but also to be responding quite rapidly to the changing situation. So we've set up our structures in government to be able to do that. So we have a cabinet committee of senior ministers who are there meeting on a daily basis, assessing information, making decisions, recommending to cabinet to make sure that, yes, while we are prepared for the long term, we're also agile enough to deal with the situation as it unfolds around us. And one thing I'll be very, very clear on in all of this is that we are taking advice from experts and from public health professionals. It's very, very easy for people to kind of get caught up in theorising around this. We have to base our response around good science. That is something that our government's very committed to, both in terms of the public health response and then in terms of how that feeds onto the economic response as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, Michael. Now, we've managed to hear from all four of you this morning. Michael, I know that you've got pressures. You've got a meeting which you need to get to very shortly. So I just want to ask you a couple of questions, because we'll open this up and have a bit of a more general discussion now. But Michael, something Priti mentioned was employers have to start being, well, I mean, they will be aware, of course, but the stress levels on their employees are going to be going through the roof right now. Now, if this is the well-being government, you guys have focused very much on the economic stimulus here. We haven't heard a lot about the well-being side of things, which you as a government have been always so strong about.
Well, look, I would say, firstly, the two things are interconnected. So an important part of people's well-being is that they're able to retain their employment. So part of the economic stimulus package, whether it's through the support around wage subsidy or leave, is about retaining that. A lot of people's feelings of self-worth, their social connections are through their employment. So if we can retain that, actually goes a long way in terms of people's well-being. But you're also dead right, beyond that, all of us, government, employers, just any person who cares about other people, needs to be aware that this is a situation that is extremely stressful and distressing for many people. So there needs to be a response there. One of the things that you may or may not have noticed so far, but will certainly be getting strongly emphasised, is that the public health messaging is actually going to have as well as the washing your hands, staying away from work, sneezing into your elbow, one core component of the public health messaging is going to be around being kind. It's going to be around looking out for people, particularly those folks who might be vulnerable, perhaps because of their physical health and being older or being compromised, but also in terms of their mental health, people who might be getting into a point of being isolated, who might be vulnerable to depression and social isolation. And again, in terms of that we're all in this together, that has to come through the public health system, but actually it's businesses, it's communities, it's family. We all have to be part of that if we want to get through and support one another around it. And I think the co-op model has a lot to be said for it in this situation. You're a business model which focuses not just on a small people walking away with a big profit, but around being here for the long term and looking after people. So I think there's an opportunity for some real modelling and lessons coming from your sector in this space.
And it gets even harder to look after people, though, doesn't it? Priti, we're all working, this idea of everyone going home and trying to work from home as much as they can. That's going to make it really hard for employers, for larger cooperatives, to be able to keep an eye on their staff and check that everyone's sort of doing as well as they can. Is it not, Priti, or is technology able to help in this sort of the human contact way as well?
I think, we've got to learn and adapt. This is not something we've been doing regularly. So I'll give you an example. Just this morning, we had a Zoom stand-up meeting. So literally checking in with our team across, whether they're working in the office or working from home, or, even commuting. Just a really quick half an hour check-in with the team. These are some key priorities for us because a lot of the times now we're responding very quickly, but this is also a way to just sort of check in with the team. How are you doing? How are you feeling? What's going on in your world? And even that small sort of, a 20-minute, half an hour check-in with the team is really a great way to understand, the mood of the team and understand who needs help when. And so we're doing that on a regular, on a daily basis. So it's a matter of practice and a matter of habit, and technology enables, this like never before. So I think it's like I said, it's just moving on to a different way of doing things and acknowledging that even the meetings online are different from the face-to-face meeting. And so this is really something that we have to get to understand, evolve, and create different habits.
Yeah,
it's a different normal now.
Particularly when it comes to leadership, get used to having a camera in your face, I guess, because that's how you're going to be communicating with your staff. Michael, before you disappear, you talked about agility and that the government's up for this. So does that mean you've got other tools in the toolbox, other ideas, which you're just keeping to the side for when you need to be agile?
Well, look, when Grant Robertson launched this package, he was clear that this is phase one of the significant response that the government is making, that there will be a need for further measures, and that we've also got the budget coming up as well. So we're certainly aware that there are going to be ongoing needs. Yeah, a part of doing this, though, has to be that we're actually communicating with people. So I think one of the reasons that phase one was received well by organisations like the EMA and others in the business sector was because we'd taken a bit of time to engage with them to work out what would actually be effective. So that's what we need to do as part of further measures. It's not just to magic up some things in an office here at the Beehive, but to actually be engaging with business, unions, civil society, other social partners to make sure that additional measures are actually going to hit the mark and make the difference that's needed. So yes, there will be further measures, but we're going to work those through carefully. We're going to try and do them in a timely way. We will do them in a timely way, but they also need to be very effective as well.
So what? Just give us an idea. You know, if you're running particularly in the cooperative world, if you're running a business, what sort of things can people look forward to?
Well, look, we're not going to specifically put anything on the table at this stage, but we're also not going to take anything off the table. Some key areas that we know we need to look at is what has been spoken about publicly, is what's happening in the aviation sector, which has a huge effect on everyone. We need to make sure that that keeps functioning. We know that there's pressure around working capital for many businesses, but we're also very clear that that is something that businesses also need to be talking to banks around, who also need to be stepping up. That's what banks are for in situations like this as well, but we're monitoring that situation very closely to make sure that we have sufficient liquidity across our economy.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Greg, just want to ask you if you're still online, just about whether you think the government's doing enough, what they're doing right, what they could be doing more of.
Oh, I think as Michael said, it's a fairly decisive response. I think in terms of packages per capita, it's probably one of the largest globally, if not the largest, 4% of GDP. And as he said, potentially more to come. Obviously, the tourism sector is facing severe headwinds. Obviously, airlines as well. Sounds like there's more to come there. And there will be businesses that struggle. But then again, we've got tools to get through, and I think it's about, and we talked on this call today about conveying some confidence on a number of levels. So we've got obviously the government doing its part. I think doing a great job there. We've got the central bank as well coming through, and we're getting prepared, which I think is a great thing, and perhaps which some countries, perhaps on the other side of the globe, didn't do, and perhaps took it a bit too lightly. And we've obviously had a bit of a window in terms of our geographic location. So look, certainly not making light of the challenges in the next sort of few quarters, as we've talked about. But I think there is a way to get through this. I think there is another side, and I think the comment made that this probably won't be a 2021 story. Certainly go along with that.
I mean, what role do you think the co-ops can play to support NZ Inc. and the health and the strength of the New Zealand economy? Greg?
Yeah, I mean, is it for me or for Priti?
I was going to ask you, Greg.
Yeah, look, I think it's I suppose a similar mantra that is being conveyed across all businesses. We've talked about agility. That's something that's obviously going to have to happen across the board, and including in the co-op model. I think peace of mind in terms of financing as well. Obviously, we're seeing the path being laid to sort of the wheels of credit still grinding. Some confidence obviously in the financial sector and the credit sector, and just keeping the economy going. But I think it's about every model, including co-ops and other businesses, sort of buying into that. We're going to get through this.
Tim, can I ask you about you're live with us from Australia, but do you think COVID-19 is driving us closer to Australia or further apart?
I'm not sure it's going to have material impacts on that front. It's clearly a very strong relationship economically and socially, and crises can have the impact of drawing people closer together. There may be some impact from that, but I'm not sure it's going to be the biggest factor out of this.
I'm hoping it's not COVID, but is your camera, could you just have a play and see if you can get your camera up so we can have a look? There we are. Awesome. Perfect. So how much do you think the rest of the world needs what New Zealand produces at the moment?
Well, the good news is they want it a lot. I think part of the story with New Zealand in the last decade, it has done a good job in pushing up into value add and products where the provenance and safety and integrity of the supply chains is so valued, which leads to a strong demand for the products, and in many cases the ability to extract premium for those products. They aren't crucial staples, though, in many markets. So if we look at a market like China, they would regard their staple products, of course, as rice and wheat, pork, amongst protein. Things like infant formula are going to be very sticky in terms of demand. But as we move into dairy to consume at home, let alone dairy to eat out, those are discretionary products in the Chinese market and in many of the emerging markets that we deal with. So offshore, we are going to see consumers still want our products, but there will be some income effect, lessening demand from this. But I would add to that, things get different when you look at the animal protein complex, because as we've alluded to before, the coronavirus is not the only shock going on in the world of agriculture right now. We still have the shock of swine fever in China. It's left them tremendously short of animal protein, and that means they have a strong demand for New Zealand sheep and beef meat at the moment that's going to help. So they need protein, they need food. There may be some trading down, but food is still a good product to be producing and exporting in this kind of environment.
Michael, Tim talked quite a lot there specifically, sort of about China generally. What do you think from a government perspective? What role could New Zealand play globally?
Well, look, a couple of key things come to mind in that space. One is we can model what a good government response looks like and an effective government response looks like. And I think that comes down to both the economic stimulus, but also really clear action around how we contain and how we flatten the curve. One of the things that the situation, I think, really helpfully reveals has been actually the importance of having good multilateral systems. We know that system has been under assault in recent years, that we've had multilateral systems who have not enjoyed the support of many global players. This reveals that we have to have linked up and effective multilateral institutions, and that's something that New Zealand's always been very supportive of and engaged in. So we'll work closely with international partners on the response there. But look, one of the other things I just wanted to say touches on this, but also in more general terms, is that we go into this phase in a good position. We've managed to keep net debt down to less than 20% now. So we've got the fiscal headroom to be able to do the things that we need to do. And so I think that in a global economy that's been pretty buffeted and has had high levels of debt over the last 10 years, the way in which New Zealand has positioned itself is a pretty good lesson that you need that headroom when these things come along.
Greg, we've been focused quite a lot on agri in the last half hour or so. What about our retailers? Your plumbers, your glass salespeople, people selling, tools out of the shed, you might have tons of foodstuffs.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, and obviously some businesses are going to be a lot more adaptable than others in terms of people being able to work from home. Look across the Tasman, Telstra's sent 20,000 of its staff to work from home for the rest of the month. Obviously a lot of businesses can't do that. People are increasingly being encouraged to stay indoors, and obviously we don't know where that's all going to go, but there's some comparisons overseas. Then there's certainly going to be some retailers that are going to feel a pinch a lot more, and they're already facing obviously a lot of structural headwinds in terms of online competition from offshore and so on. So there's no denying it's going to be tough. I mean, another point, I suppose, again, if we're looking for silver linings, and commodities prices generally have pretty much held the line quite well, except in the case of oil, which obviously, we talk about shocks. There's another shock that we've had to deal with, but I suppose, as a key input, that's going to provide a little bit of relief to some. That may obviously take a while to come through in terms of input costs for the retailers and that. But you're quite right, plumbers and people that sort of face-to-face with their customers, are going to be in for a tough time. But, we have had this relief package coming through from the government, that obviously wage tax relief, subsidies, it's all about trying to keep, some positivity. And as I say, the message is sort of getting through it. So, but it's not going to be, certainly not going to be a bed of roses for some in the sector. And of course, the airlines as well, and it's going to be potentially knock-on impact there. I don't know what we're going to be seeing there in terms of layoffs and the like, but assistance coming through there as well. Look, another point in terms of our ability to withstand shocks, obviously the ministers talked about the financial position of NZ Inc. effectively, and a lot of corporations have been preparing for, I suppose, rainy days, as it were. And also, you look at the unemployment rate. We've effectively got full employment in this country. So, look, that may well change, but I think we've got an ability to withstand a shock there as well.
As long as our infotech infrastructure is up to it, Priti, is it?
Yeah. I think just something to really keep in mind here is in the next 3 months or so, our habits are changing. It takes approximately 66 days precisely for a new habit to form. So while we're in isolation, and to all of the points that have been shared, these unprecedented circumstances are creating new habits in all of us. Whether that's buying habits, consuming habits, working habits, and all of the above, right? So we've got to be thinking ahead in terms of, as businesses, as leaders, how is this going to impact our economy, our businesses in the long term? And so I think, from that point of view, there's some real thinking that needs to be done. And again, to my point around developing that and, this is your core, but how else do you sort of predict and respond to these changing habits and changing demographic patterns is going to be paramount.
So we're running short on the time here. So I just want to ask all four of you individually very quickly, what do you think the biggest risks are to cooperatively owned and run enterprises at the moment? And I'll start with you, Priti.
I think just to carry on from what I just said, I think just being under the impression that in 3 months when things start to, or maybe less, when it actually starts becoming, different, we can't expect, business as usual. We are going to have to prepare for a different dynamic, a different ecosystem, a different economy, I think. And so just to begin to think about that from now, I think will make a lot of sense.
So the risk being, if you don't start applying new thinking, you're going to struggle to get back on the ship. Michael, what about yourself? What's the biggest risk?
Look, I think that the two key things, as I said before, are confidence and cash flow. This is a difficult period, but if collectively between government and business, we can keep a level of confidence, we can keep cash flow flowing through our businesses and into the pockets of wage and salary earners, those are the ways that we get through. If those things stop, that's when we have a real problem. That's why the package was as significant as it was this week. And I think that the co-op sector it's going to be difficult, but is well placed because of the deep roots you have in communities, because of the long-term nature of the businesses that you operate, to weather this through and actually to help the broader economy push through and keep moving. Yeah,
and it'll be interesting to see. It's a well-timed budget coming up in a couple of months, because that's the next time I guess we'll see, where we're at. Tim, biggest risks?
I think cooperatives will just have to keep a close eye on their need and access to capital. But it is a business structure that has different ways of accessing capital, to some extent more constraints than other business models. And just watch as they go through this, that they balance the need to look after their shareholders, in many cases suppliers, with the ongoing margins in the business, and the ability to access the capital that they'll need to get through this and rebuild out the other side where required.
And Greg, I'll finish with you.
Certainly going along with Priti, I mean, probably the biggest risk is that there is a failure to adapt, to become agile. That's part of the message we've talked about. Things are going to be a lot different over the next few months, and they're probably going to be quite tough. So businesses need to adapt, and that applies to the co-op space as well. As I said, look, I think some confidence can be taken from responses. We've talked about these on a number of levels in terms of trying to flatten the curve. That's the biggest thing. Last thing we want is 80% of the population having the health system being overloaded and literally, panic, which we've already seen, I suppose, in minor degrees. So adaptability, but also having some confidence that responses are being taken on a number of levels.
Yeah, and that's that word confidence just keeps coming through. I'm going to wrap this up, team, but a huge amount of thank you to all of you. Michael's just had to slip away to a meeting. But so the themes here are leadership change, adaptability, confidence, and from a government perspective, cash flow. It's interesting times, but Tim, Greg, Priti, and Michael, thank you so much for your time this morning. It's much appreciated. And this was a Cooperative Business New Zealand special presentation. Say again, thank you to Rabobank New Zealand for your support in helping us bring this to the members. Thank you all.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. Our panelists and Rawdon, really appreciate your time, and hopefully all of you watching got some real benefit out of the session. I have to say I did. Really inspired by some of the messaging that we heard. In terms of the outputs from today, we will look to consolidate the messaging and provide them back to our members, and really would love to hear from you. It's really important that we understand the challenges that you're facing and we can help you work through that time. Just wishing you a safe journey along the next period of time, and we'll look forward to staying in touch.